When the taste for physical gratifications among them has grown more rapidly than their education or experience, the time will come when men lose all self-restraint. Alexander de Tocqueville.
Welcome back to Analyzing Finance with Nick. I'm bringing back the conversation about Prole drift. You guys seem to really like the last time I talked about this, and I'm going to talk about more examples beyond just the definitions of Prole drift in terms of like relationships and family structure, more to other things such as hobbies, political ideology, how they approach their free time, etc. And just to keep everybody caught up, like a definition for Prole drift that I'm going to use for this is the process which declining economic conditions among the middle classes especially, but it can apply to pretty much any social class, forces them to adopt lower class behaviors which are then reframed as intentional lifestyle choices. This is mainly done to preserve their self-image and maintain social cohesion so people don't get so mad that they rebel against the fact that they are slowly falling down the socioeconomic ladder and losing economic agency. It also covers up for the fact that people who thought they were in the middle class or people who thought they were in the upper middle class really aren't. The core cognitive dissonance here is just like an inconsistency to the class identity that you believe you are versus where you really are. A lot of previous markers of middle or upper middle class achievement, such as home ownership, marriage, families, particularly larger families, regular vacations, retirement savings that can cover your retirement to be able to quit working by 60, I've become out of reach for many people. And so rather than admit downward mobility, they rationalize it by saying, hey, look, I'm child free by choice. Marriage is an outdated institution and traditional family structures are oppressive. I want something more alternative. I don't believe in owning property. Working at a job is for sellouts. Don't start a business because you're going to fail 95% of the time anyway. These are examples mostly caused by things such as wage stagnation, housing unaffordability, declining social mobility, falling real wages due to inflation, and crowding out of government spending versus other aspects of the economy. The internet creating a more winner-take-all economy across every industry. The traditional status pathways kind of dying out, and just the increased cost of childcare. People now have to create these new narratives such as like material constraint as a good thing, or reframing basically their lack of achievement versus like to make it an actual choice and a better lifestyle in reality. A lot of it, they feel like they belong in a certain social class, such as having a certain level of education or living in a certain neighborhood, but they really can't actually hit those goals without having to move down a social class, which is kind of hurts everybody's ego. With that out of the way, let's move to some examples really of Prole drift. Like the most common example, and before I get to it, I have realized that I've inherited some Prole drift without even knowing it. I think all of us have to a certain degree. I don't really mean this to offend anybody in particular, but at the same time, you guys like when I'm honest. And so I might say some things that probably hurt your identity a little bit or might be considered offensive. But without further ado, let's get started. There's a lot of Prole drift when it comes to aesthetics. The first one is just the normalization of dirty cities, whether it's graffiti, whether it's littering, whether it's the toleration of homelessness. This is all kind of a Prole drift in the sense. Like if you go watch these old videos, there's this really good YouTube channel I'll put in the description. It shows colored clips of all the big cities in the world from 1900 to 1950. And one thing you'll realize is how clean it is and how everybody is well dressed. And it's not really that way today anymore. Why is it not that way? I think a lot of it is due to Prole drift, like wearing more casual fashion. And yeah, somebody's wearing like a bright teal colored shirt and not a suit right now. I'm guilty of this as just as anybody. Has become more popular because it's not only financially more affordable, the percentage of money spent on clothes is about 10% less of your budget now than it was in the 1950s. People spent over 10% of their income on clothing and apparel, whereas today it's like 3% or less. So people were wearing cheaper made clothes so they can have more variety and have be more comfortable, but it comes at the expense of not looking as refined and wearing stuff that's going to fall apart and not look as nice as long. It's kind of a prole drift in our fashion in a sense. Fast fashion such as Zara and Forever 21 when it was around and other things like that is kind of the most extreme examples of prole drift in fashion, going away from things that were made to last forever and very elegant to more casual stuff that you throw away after a few wears is an example of prole drift in fashion, and athleisure becoming the default attire versus wearing a suit and a tie if you're a man or a nice dress every day if you're a woman. Another example of aesthetic prole drift is tattoos and piercings outside the ear becoming mainstream. These are once really considered really taboo and were only found among like sailors and people in organized crime and kind of more working class backgrounds. They became started mainstream really starting with the 90s, and it continued to accelerate, particularly among millennials, which were the peak generation for tattoos. And they were also, coincidentally, the peak generation for economic precarity and downward social class mobility. You now see it with professions that you would previously not expect to have tattoos, such as doctors, lawyers, business owners, tech employees. It's often rationalized as self-expression when it's really just a negative class signal. It's kind of an elephant in the room that nobody wants to acknowledge. Van life culture and embracing that is another example, like romanticizing or living in tiny homes. Like it's romanticizing living like what people would condemn as like trailer park life, or like being basically homeless and sleeping in your car is now rebranded as an adventure and minimalism when it was previously like you're struggling and not doing well in life. And it's an example of economically forced decisions being rebranded as chosen alternative lifestyle choices. The other example is the devaluation of professional titles. Like some people, instead of saying they're unemployed, they're an entrepreneur. Everybody, instead of saying that you occasionally give advice to people, you're now a coach or a strategist. You have no credentials. You have no like affiliation with a company. Like you have a consultant instead of saying that you are semi-retired or between jobs. It's like you have these titles that usually meant something. Like a coach literally means you were like a coach of a team at a school or a professional sports team or for an organization. And a consultant, you thought you would be working at a place like McKinsey or Bain, traveling around and giving businesses advice. Or a strategist, like you were working at a hedge fund or a think tank discussing strategy. Now, anybody with LinkedIn can brand themselves as these things. And people make fun of it all the time, but it's an example of prole drift of job titles in general. Now, their really thing is like food. Like, instead of every family sitting together for dinner for an hour, undistracted conversation time, we've now lived in a world where basically people eat separately. There's often a lot of places don't even have kitchens anymore. They don't even have formal dining rooms anymore because of smaller living spaces or because of different schedules due to parents working two different jobs instead of having one at home and one working, or single parent dynamics, so people have to work longer hours to cover a family without the help of a second parent. It's just not financially viable to have everybody together and have a home-cooked meal. Instead, you normalize things that were considered low-class alternatives, such as eating fast food and having frozen food and meal kits. They've now become fast casual. It's like Chipotle now be considering or of a middle-class aspirational brand when it really is similar to fast food in the past with slightly better food quality. And you have meal kits, which are maybe a little better quality than frozen food, but still not the same as having a fresh home-cooked meal in a way. And also a lot of people are living alone. Cooking doesn't really make as much sense. like a full meal if you're living alone. And I think that's the other thing too, is you have increased hostility to traditional aspirations, where like you see people who get judged negatively in a lot of communities for dressing formal, discussing financial literacy, or talking about things like saving money. Etiquette, like traditional etiquette you'd get in a cotillion class, is not really valued as much. People look at you as an elitist if you try to push that kind of thing. Classical education, traditional nuclear family structures, this stretches across the ideology. A lot of this stuff is looked down upon as being pretentious. Also, the elimination of the idea of certain basic proprieties. Even when I was a child, and I'm not that old, swearing was generally looked down upon. Like, my parents would never say curse words in front of me. At school, it was heavily condoned, and if I did say anything like that, I would get soap in my mouth up until my early teens. It's become more mainstream for people using curse words and relatively foul language, especially more common with women. Previously, foul language in general was considered a low-class behavior, and it's now kind of drifted up the social class ladder. The next real thing would be is like hobbies. Like hobbies used to be involving like a committed time to like building something. Like a middle class hobby would be something like gardening or home improvement or learning a musical instrument or doing civic involvement or learning a new sport. Now hobbies have been replaced with consumption hobbies, which are more common among the working classes, such as drinking, watching TV, or streaming and watching online media. They're just sitting around listening to music. Like high-skilled hobbies, people don't have time anymore because of economic precarity and longer hours, maybe because of that. Now you have people justifying switching from, or just they're lacking the energy because of like mental exhaustion. So a lot of like these higher skilled hobbies that were more common among the middle class are being considered either being rebranded as boring. Golf is another good example of this. Golf is becoming increasingly less affordable for certain groups in society, and so instead of saying, oh, I can't afford golf, it's like, oh, I just think it's boring. I mean, there's some people legitimately think that golf is boring even if they have money. So there's always exceptions to these rules. There's people who have legitimate ideological changes for these, but I'm just using common examples. Like high-skilled, high-time commitment hobbies are replaced by consumption hobbies. All you have to do is sit there and consume, whether visually or through eating, like going to a restaurant, example, and passive activities replace more active activities. Things like antinatalism, anti-ambition, anti-ownership rhetoric has become more common, admitting you can't really afford these things. You just bash anybody who still wants them because you can't really have them. It's kind of like working class grievances disguised as alternative lifestyles. You have, in general, more crude speech and more emotional outbursts in public, which previously were not socially acceptable if you were over the age of 10 years old, now have become more common and more tolerated. You see also, in general, with like, all right, so yeah, that's kind of one example. The other thing is like parenting. You're starting to see a switch towards, you see active, among upper classes, still very active parenting, but the Prole drift is outsourcing parenting to TV, which was kind of a stereotype of lower class. If you don't have the time to spend with your kids because you have to work or can't afford a babysitter, you just turn on the TV and have them sit and watch that all day. And it was really frowned upon in the 70s and 80s. Now we've replaced that with the iPad kid, which is essentially the same thing, but nobody really wants to admit that. You also have a decline in things out of the name of safety or busyness, but it might just be more financial restraints, like the decline in family reunions, rite of passage ceremonies, such as like first communions, confirmations, bar mitzvahs, etc. Less birthday parties, less graduation parties, like just formalizing milestones and celebrating them, because gets more cost prohibitive to do so, and those things generally aren't as celebrated, and achievements generally aren't as celebrated as much in working classes, and that's kind of starting to move up. The other thing too is intentional under furnishing. Like if instead of not being able to afford to buy furniture, you live a more minimalist lifestyle with no furniture. Lack of art or decor, like paintings on your wall is considered unnecessary, but some people live years with blank walls just to save money. I already talked about the relationship ones before, but this also stretches to political ideologies. You have just a more crude form of politics. For example, in 2004, Howard Dean's Democratic primary basically got destroyed by him making a little too enthusiastic of a scream after one of his speeches during the primary season. And he basically lost a primary because of sounding a little clownish. Now that would not even be considered at all. And the kind of stuff we tolerate from our politicians on either side of the aisle that would previously be scandalous is now more normal because people don't hold people to the old moral standards anymore. They've adopted more of the working class mentality that like you got to do what it takes to win. There's really no room for propriety. And that's kind of another example of prole drift. So yeah, that's my take on this. I'm also going to do a commentary about the geography of prole drift in the next video. But let me know what you think. Do you guys keep going with this? What are some examples of prole drift that I am missing that are fairly common or that are just right in front of your face that really people don't notice? Let me know what you think, and thank you for watching.